Three. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to episode 3 of the Geoconservative files. My name is Mr. Geocon, and with me tonight is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Todd, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello. Thanks for having me on, Mr. Geocon. I'm Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. People might know me from some videos I used to do with Keith Preston on his defunct podcast, Attack the System. He's been a common invitee to my channels now that I have one going. Maybe one might remember me from the Mouthy Buddha stream with the trad theist versus the atheist. But generally what I do is I do general podcasts on issues that I think are interesting, political, religious, economic, current events, whatever, debates, roundtables, trying to create a sort of thought space akin to William F. Buckley Jr.'s firing line.
Oh, yes. I have seen a few episodes of Firing Line, and I do think that some of your, actually a lot of your discussions come across as sort of a modern version of Firing Line. And although I do think that you'd have on guests that William F. Buckley would never dream of having on, like, didn't you debate a few of the alt-righters a couple years back when they were still pretty big?
I debated some New reactionaries. I almost debated Greg Johnson, but as we got closer to the due date, he bailed, which was unfortunate.
Oh, that is unfortunate. I think I remember you telling me about that. What was it, a year ago? Yeah, that would have been a very interesting debate. It's just a shame that that was cut short. You've also debated a few libertarians, right?
Oh yeah.
Why don't you tell me a little bit? What were those debates about?
Well, I debated Walter Block and Stefan Kinsella on the NAP. They argued in the affirmative, I argued in the negative. And I made an appearance on the Tom Wood show debating Bob Murphy on private defense.
Oh, wow. That's, well, check you'll have to, guys, links in the show notes. You can check out his channel and watch those debates. I'm sure they'll get a lot out of them. But have you debated any leftists?
Yes, Banana Warrior Princess, the vegan. There was a vegan debate I had like 2 years ago. I have a mirror of it on my channel. That was kind of a dumpster fire. Vegans are not honest actors.
Oh, well, that's unfortunate. But the reason I asked you about if you debated any leftists is because it's an increasingly rare occurrence in our modern political space to have left debate right, at least not far right, in the dissident right, the far right sphere. Do you notice that?
Yeah, the last time we had anything really like that was when Dave the Distributist debated Christy Winters. And even then, he sort of had the support of Sargon and other more moderate alt-light figures. So it wasn't even an alt-right debate. Even when Andy Worski was doing blood sports, it was the alt-light versus the alt-right. Progressives really didn't show up in that.
That is, well, to be fair, Andy Worski's blood sports kind of went downhill after a while. So I don't blame certain progressives for not wanting to get onto it.
True.
So so what I have you on here today to talk about is some of the comments you've made to me on the on Discord, and these comments do stand out for a number of reasons. I think that I think the reason why is these comments are these statements are pretty much taken for granted amongst a lot of people in dissident right circles, but outside of those circles, they are highly controversial. And in a lot of ways, these ideas, these axioms, these precepts, seem to underlie a lot of the animosity the mainstream has for the dissident right. And I'll read out a sort of a paraphrase of what you've said. If to all right, to quote what to sort of paraphrase what you said, if you are a white man in 2019 and you do not realize, one, there is a war on men by women and feminism killed everything. Two, atheism is BS and killed everything. And three, there is a war on whites by everyone and elitist traitors. Then I have to question your reasoning skills. Can you really? Can you? That's you have to admit that's a very controversial statement in modern times. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, let's deal with the first part, the feminist women question. So, there is in fact a book entitled "The War on Boys" by Christina Hoff Sommers from the AEI. And she pointed out that a lot of the drugging of boys in public schools with Adderall and Ritalin is in part to neuter their masculinity. And also, a side effect seems to be that violence is a result of some of that, which is one plausible explanation for the rise in school shootings and shootings in general. But notice, it's targeting boys, not girls. They're not pumping girls full of drugs to make them more like boys. They're pumping boys full of drugs to make them more like girls. There is the famous James Younger case in Texas, where some feminist harpy mom wants to chemically castrate her son. I mean, he's only 7 years old. He doesn't even know what he's consenting to, even if he says he does because mommy told him to. What is this?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit about the James Younger case. I believe what happened was that his son likes a female. There was a female superhero named Starfire. She's from an old TV show called Teen Titans, and the son liked this character, and as kids are, they want to be He wanted to be Starfire. Not because she was a girl, but because she could fly and has super strength and can throw lasers at people. Throw laser bolts at people. So it's kind of, and then the mom sort of twisted that into, well, you have to be a girl named Luna.
Yeah, for also. Obviously, there are women that transition to trans men, but that's never pushed. That's never in the public eye. It's always men being castrated to become women. They're always pushing trans women, never trans men. Why? Well, because it's a war on men. They want men to castrate themselves, literally as well as figuratively. Furthermore, you can look at all of the toxic masculinity, the titles of articles in Vox and HuffPo and all of these, left-wing cringe websites. There's no such term as toxic femininity, which should tell you something, as well as the fact that it's, without getting into all the details, the MRAs, the MGTOWs, and the Manosphere have proven again and again that data shows women get lighter sentences for the same crimes as men. Women are more likely to win custody battles for the child. Women are more likely to be trusted in a domestic lawsuit than the man. Men are often afraid to bring charges against their wife for initiating force with a gun or a knife. Because, in fact, there are cases where men have called the police and the police have arrested the man, even though the woman initiated the altercation with a knife or a gun or some other object she was going to throw. And again and again and again, we see the courts in the political system acting in favor of women. Women's reproductive issues and sexual issues are political interest groups, whereas men's are not. So again and again and again, all across the line, women are given preferential treatment, and men are, well, and again, it's when people talk about fragile masculinity, I mean, what do you expect if you're a kid from the 90s who's now, you know, a 25, 30-year-old man who was pumped full of drugs in school because you were too rambunctious? Of course you're going to be a fragile male. They've declared biological warfare on you. What do you expect?
All right. So, what about the? And can you elaborate on the atheism is BS and killed everything part?
Well, atheism is BS. Well, it's fundamentally the most direct way to prove that atheism is BS is to look at the law of identity. So there's there's the trinity of logic: the law of the identity, the law of the excluded middle, the law of non-contradiction. The law of identity says that A is identical to A if and A is identical to B if and only if A and B share exactly the same properties P at time T. So, for example, Donald Trump is identical to the President of the United States if and only if the President of the United States at time P, T, shares all the properties P with Donald Trump, which in this case, he does. But, you know, 5 years from now, even if Trump gets reelected, it won't. So now we can determine, well, what's identity if they have exactly the same properties. Now, atheism is predicated on materialism and mind-brain identity. But Leibniz expounded on the law of identity a little bit further. Well, actually, I just explained it. The properties P at time T. It's called the Leibnizian law of identity. So if you can demonstrate that two concepts or objects A and B lack even one property in common, they cannot be identical. And we know the mind and the brain cannot be identical for a few reasons. There's the idea of incorrigibility. Now, incorrigible in this case does not mean you're intransigent and won't change your mind. It means it's the only way you can access it is through some sort of immediate action. So if you want to ask me what my mental state is, only I know what that is. You might be able to have a brain surgeon, you know, using the CAT scan to read my brain states and measuring the chemical output, but none of them can tell you what my mental states are. It's impossible. It's not a problem of training or technique. It's just flat out, you can't do it. Only I can tell you what my internal mental states are. Then there's the principle of indivisibility, the idea that you cannot divide it. So the idea is we can talk about, you know, cut me half a pound of fish. We know what that means. But what's half a pound of my sensation of pain this instant? That's an utterly nonsensical statement. And then the other one is indubitability, which means, which is what Descartes' principle is, the thing that cannot be doubted. So he argues, I cannot doubt that I exist because even if I believe I'm being deceived, there's still an I there being deceived. There's still that thing there that is the fundamental, indubitable essence. And so based on the law of identity, mental states have properties not identical to brain states. Therefore, mental and brain states are not identical. Therefore, mind-brain duality is false. And the 20th century is a veritable charnel house of failed atheist experiments, which atheists don't want to admit. And the sort of last hurrah of atheism, the new atheists, Richard Dawkins admitted as of a couple months ago, it was a total failure. And that against his better wishes, it seems that people are better, are more morally upright if they believe someone is watching. So even from one of the flagship members of the Four Horsemen of the Atheist Apocalypse, Richard Dawkins admitted it was a failure. So it's metaphysically insane and violates the most fundamental principle of metaphysics, the law of identity. And its historical track record speaks for itself.
All right, fair enough. I think we don't really need to go into what the atheist societies you're referring to, i.e., the Soviet Union and how it failed in a catastrophic way. But what about this last question? there is a war on whites by everyone and elitist traitors. Now, of the three statements, this one seems to be the most controversial. Yeah, can you elaborate on this and maybe give your answer as to why it's so controversial in the modern age?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. When the alt-right first came on the scene about 8 years ago, I was sort of interested in it, and I followed it with a critical eye. A lot of the sort of pagan, atheist, anti-Christian LARPing was off-putting, and I thought they somewhat overstated their case. But I guess if you marinate in something long enough, it starts to sink in. And all other nations in the world are allowed to have border controls. Mexico has a border control that keeps Guatemalans out. Japan has a border control that keeps Koreans out. Only white Western European countries and Canada and the United States and Dominion states like Australia are not allowed to have border controls. And furthermore, when a non-white nation has border controls and prevents, for example, there's a humanitarian crisis in Syria. Turkey is doing everything in its power to keep Syrians from coming into Turkey. Where's the outrage at Turkey for not letting in Syrian refugees? For that matter, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq. Well, Iraq's a failed state too, but Jordan, Saudi Arabia, not letting in these immigrants. You know, the Gulf states like Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, nothing, and because they have strict border controls. And okay, so why? And you look at the United States, you can have the NAACP for Black people, you can have Hispanic groups, you can have all of these ethnic interest groups except whites. Now, you'll get this patently absurd claim that, well, most elected people are white, therefore it's in the interest of white people. Well, that makes about as much sense as saying that because Idi Amin and Mugabe were Black, these were Black dictators that ruled in favor of Black people. Given that they both murdered hundreds of thousands of their own people, that obviously doesn't follow. Also, we've got people like Noel Ignatieff who talk about whiteness has to be eliminated to end racism.
Yeah, he actually passed away recently. God have mercy on his soul.
So we have that. We've got the fact that everywhere we go, white people are under attack. I mean, you can't, if you're a person of color of any kind, the media automatically comes to your aid. For example, if there's youth violence against somebody and the offender is white, it'll be white male shot up a Jewish, gay, whatever bar, whatever. If it's a bunch of Black people or Arabs, young male violence. Right. So like the Cologne rapes. Young male violence, right? Because German white guys just go out and mass rape their women in Cologne, right? Or the grooming gangs in Rotherham. Young men. It's just young men, disaffected young. Because we all know English disaffected young men have, groomed 6-year-old English girls for sex trafficking. I mean, the way they report it is just criminal. And so, again, you go along this way, and ultimately, I think the end game. Well, we've already seen the end game in some of his works on the technocratic society. Bertrand Russell talks about in the Scientific Outlook the idea that the New World Order seeks to create two classes of human beings: a sort of elite planner class that runs everything, and then a sort of amalgamated, in his own words, coffee-colored race that is the working class. And it's often called the Kalergi plan, based off of an early 20th century Austro-German European Union advocate. And
hey, what is this book by Bertrand Russell? Oh, that details.
There's two books. There's the Scientific Outlook and the Impact of Science Upon Society. And he basically says that there's going to be a two-tiered class system. And it's not only that. There was a book in the 1930s by the American. Well, it wasn't a book. It was more of a proposition piece by the American Historical Association, where they were talking about the need to change American education. This is like 1938. The need to change American education from a individualistic, traditional American frontier spirit to that of collectivism, where an elite class will rule over everyone else, and they'll just have this dumbed down education, and then be all amalgamated into a single mutt race. And Kalergi's argument was it makes people easier to control, and he pointed to the mestizos of Latin America.
So it's not real. So it's really about it's real. So it's really about the the control. It's not so much, they hate what they hate white people. Although, granted, there are probably a lot of leftists who do honestly hate white people. It's about trying to amalgamate all these different groups with different cultures and basically liquidate their cultures and turn them into basically these indifferentiated widgets.
Well, the other element too that it transparently shows this anti-white prejudice is people talk about white privilege. Well, no, white privilege is a joke. Let's talk about Jewish privilege. 2% of the population of the United States owns over half the communications and banking in the country. They have the highest IQs, the highest median income household earnings. Yeah, they don't have privilege, but we never hear about that. And in fact, the authors of because this is a part of the broader anti-white push, and also the anti-Christian, anti-family, anti-male push, The Authoritarian Personality by Horkheimer and Adorno, the Frankfurt School, they point out that anti-Semitism is a pathology. Of course, not hatred of white people. And of course, who funded it? The American Jewish Society. They funded the printing of The Authoritarian Personality, which is blood libel against men, Christians, and white people, the Americans. I mean, the Americans fought to defeat Hitler. There's literally no way that the American family is fascist. And yet, again, conflict of interest, methinks.
Yeah, I would say that if you look at, I mean, if I may, a brief aside, a lot of people on the alt-right will talk about these kinds of all these Jewish conspiracy theories. The idea that, oh well, the Jews are controlling everything, and you have people like Kevin McDonald talking about how it's like a genetically programmed reproductive strategy. But really, I think it boils down to two different statistics. High intelligence quotients and concentration in urban areas means that Jews are able to be overrepresented in any intellectual activity, including political intellectual activities, including left-wing ones too. And then there's the other stat, which shows, I think it's Pew Research did a survey of Jews, and they found that 75% of Jews in America hold that remembering the Holocaust is the most essential part of Jewish identity. Can you imagine having 75% of the brightest and smartest people in your country just spiritually traumatized by what was admittedly a horrific massacre, that they are pretty much pathological of it? It's no wonder these people will conflate. These people are conflating things that they believed are essential to Hitlerism, which is Christianity, because of the historic animus between Jews and Christians. Whiteness, because Hitler was a Nordicist, and men, because fascism was very masculine. And because of this, that is why a great deal of Jews are involved in this war, so to speak. What do you think of this theory?
I think there's some credence to it. I would tend to prefer the E. Michael Jones explanation of the Jewish behavior rather than a sort of genetic determinism of the alt-right. I tend to not find deterministic arguments entirely compelling, because then that fails to take into account how Philo-Semitic England after Oliver Cromwell only started to suffer negative consequences in the late 20th century.
Oh, fair enough. Fair enough. I do think that's I think that is a fair point. But I want to go over a little bit about the each part of the little acronym: war, women, atheism, race, and I want to go through each of these three parts, and I want to give some questions into you that sort of challenge this sort of reactionary worldview that you've laid out right here. These kind of dissident right positions that you've laid out here, and see where this takes us. Because I think what we ought to do is we need to take some of the left wing criticisms seriously. And I mean, granted, a lot of them sound ridiculous when they're stated by some of the crazies you meet on the street, but they are believed by a lot of very smart people. So I think it'd only be fair if we address them right here, and maybe this will make our argument stronger. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say pro tip: right people make left-wing arguments better than left-wing people.
I guess. So yeah, there is some truth to that. I would find. So being that as me, we'll start with women. And my first question on the woman question is: advocates of feminism claim that they are simply trying to overthrow a system that has historically mistreated women to equalize the playing field between men and women. Why is this wrong?
Well, the left often says today that when white straight men claim they're being oppressed, justice feels like oppression to the oppressor. Well, I would say, okay, justice felt like oppression to the women because when they become the oppressors, it's pretty terrible. So, I mean, I would just turn the leftist retort back on its head.
But okay, but that's sort of the so you're saying that what the mistreatment that women felt in the past was actually justice or justified in some way?
Yeah, it's perceived as persecution, but it wasn't. Just in the same way that they'll say a straight white male complaining of being discriminated against. That's not really discrimination. That's just justice.
Okay, but why would you say it is justice? Do you actually, or are you just turning their argument back on them, or do you really think that this mistreatment, quote unquote, was justified in some way?
Well, I mean, part of it is rhetorical, but as to the other part, when the left says they're dealing with perceived injustices against women, there's a few problems with this. One, the people who were involved are all dead. So how long does one side have to pay the other side until justice is completed? Justice in the Western context, by definition, isn't between people that are already dead. It's between people that are living. And it's usually some sort of distributive justice per Aristotle, and then later through the Aristotelian Christian synthesis, some sort of distributive justice based off of between already existing people. Now they're dead. And then furthermore, the set of starting assumptions the feminists have that would say this or that treatment is injustice is based on, I think, the fundamental principle is the fungibility of humans. Fungibility is an economic concept that says all things X are identical enough when it comes to economic transactions. Now, that's patently absurd, but if you believe that, then all actual observed non-equal outcomes have to be attributed to some environmental condition. And that's then attributed to injustice and oppression, rather than internal inequalities, which they a priori reject and have given us no reason to believe is true at all. So it's they look at inequalities that happen and they say it's a sign of oppression rather than sign of latent inequality between the sexes. And they just refuse to even consider that option. And furthermore, they haven't even proven that we're fungible in the first place.
All right. I guess that's fair enough. I mean, egalitarianism, when you think about it, is a sort of a controversial statement, but and that sort of leads me to my next question. Most people outside of the most radical feminists acknowledge that men are physically superior to women, but couldn't the psychological differences between men and women be attributed to culture rather than genetics?
Well, when we deal with the question that I think you're getting at, and it's a little more contentious, is that men are smarter than women. And most people who aren't radical feminists will admit that men are stronger than women. But the fact that men are smarter than women is obvious. Who were all the chess grandmasters? In fact, who were all the Scrabble masters? There's no sex barrier to entry. But if you look at the list of all the chess, the grandmasters, at the world level champion winners, they're all men. Usually Jews, Russians, or white Americans. Or even a game like Scrabble, it's just a dictionary game. Men are the winners. Women can't compete at the highest levels. And again, you can't say there's discrimination because there's no barrier to entry. Women can of course compete. They're just not good enough.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some of these bell curves where there are more men on either end. There's a lot more male geniuses and a lot more male idiots, and women are more concentrated in the middle. Would you agree to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the general bell curve consensus.
I see. So you would attribute to these inequalities between the sexes, some of these past inequalities, to male physical superiority and male intellectual superiority.
Yes, we're not fungible.
All right, fair enough. What about sort of the behavioral differences between men and women? I mean, men might be smarter, but there's in general, men might be smarter, but there are also these masculine traits and feminine traits that feminists seem to think that are culturally based. Do you think that they're entirely culturally based, or is there also a biological a factor?
Well, the idea of the sort of it's all environmental was popularized with B.F. Skinner and behaviorism, and in the United States, the CIA and other intelligence agencies, there was Mockingbird, and there were other secret black ops where they tried to psychologically re-engineer people. And there's been documentaries about it, and they've all just were failures. People are not nearly as malleable as their philosophy, their ideology would have led them to believe. And we saw the same thing in the Soviet Union, right? According to egalitarianism and materialism, if you control for material outcomes, then you will change personal behavior. But the Soviet Union implemented these new material conditions, and the new socialist man never materialized. And the same old human traits that they complained about in 1917 were still present in 1987. And ultimately, the dysphoria between the communist ideal and human realities led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the idea Now, I'm not a biological determinist like the alt-right. I think there is a certain level of cultural malleability, but there's hard caps that biology puts on you. So, I mean, obviously, the fact that women are mothers and have children is a biological fact, not a cultural fact. And obviously, men can't have children. That's a biological, not a cultural fact. So I think there is some malleability of culture, but only to a point. And the range is a lot less than behaviorists and egalitarians would think, as we've seen from the historical empirical record. And biology is fairly determinative of these things. With like the signs of epigenetics, you can inherit traits from your parents. So, for example, one of the things that we know is if you were an alcoholic, certain negative biological traits can be passed on to your children via epigenetics.
I see. Yes. So you would say that some of the traditionally masculine traits like aggressiveness and competitiveness might have had a biological factor behind them, and that biological factor might have also led to male inequality between men and women.
Yes.
All right. So my next question is, it's sort of, this hits on another left-wing talking point, but that I'd like to hear you address. In every society, there are always individuals that do not fit exactly the society's mold of what is masculine and what is feminine. You always have you always have your tomboys and your effeminate guys. How are they supposed to fit into the society when they can't really seem to fit that societal mold that of masculine and feminine?
Yeah, tomboys and dandies. Now, historically, I think these are a relatively small minority of any given population. And in Western societies, they tend to be tolerated to a point. For example, Aristotle was a bit of a dandy. A lot of the cavaliers of the 17th century were dandies. But they also had classical masculine traits of aggressiveness and violence as well. So, take it or leave it. But I mean, this doesn't necessarily seem to be that big of an issue. For example, we all know what a well-constituted human body is and what it should be doing. Somebody might have sickle cell anemia. Okay, that's really unfortunate. And we know that's an aberration of a sort. And we can make allowances for that because obviously that person didn't choose to have sickle cell anemia, or maybe you're born lame or whatever. But the abnormal or the aberrant shouldn't be seen as a huge problem, because that's just we all intuitively just accept the aberrant is normal when it comes to purely physical traits, like your blood type, or sickle cell anemia, or low white blood cell count, or all these other things, because they're not political. Those are not politicized. But when gender identity is politicized, well, then now it becomes a political interest group, and now it's considered something more important than it really is.
So you would say, in essence, that these exceptions should not determine the rule.
Exactly. As I like to say it, we don't want to build society around the needs of a quadriplegic Black Muslim trans woman autodidact.
So would you say that such people, they would be given allowances for their eccentricity, but we wouldn't rewrite the rules on their behalf?
Exactly.
All right. I think that's a fair enough point. I mean, so there's also, this gets us to our next question of patriarchy. Now, you hear a lot about patriarchy as an ideal, both from feminists who blame it for everything that's wrong with society, and from sort of these and these MGTOW types and these traditionalist types who want to revive it in the modern day. What is patriarchy exactly, and should we have one?
Well, again, you did hint at the problem of definitions. The definitions that I run with is a patriarchy is a political social system in which men have the legal privileges. So, for example, one of the things feminists complained about in 19th century England was the husband had conjugal rights over his spouse. That is patriarchy. Yes, we don't have that now, so it's hard to argue how we have a patriarchy now. I think
well, most of the people in charge are men.
Yeah, but again, that's as facile as saying that Idi Amin and Mugabe were black. Therefore, despite the fact they massacred hundreds of thousands of their own people, that this is black empowerment.
So you would say that patriarchy is contrasted with legal egalitarianism, but because there are a different set of rules that apply to men. Men have more legal rights than women under patriarchy.
Mm-hmm. Now, the patriarchy, as the left, as feminists criticize it, I think there's really two distinct components that are not really related. So there's the biological component we already mentioned. If in theory we could remove all legal privileges from one side or the other, which many alt-right individuals think, for example, Sargon of Akkad has said this numerous times, there's no need for feminism anymore because we've already got equal rights. Well, okay, let's assume for the sake of argument we've reached that stage. Well, there's certain inscrutable biological traits that are going to lead to unequal outcomes. So even if you remove all privilege, you're still going to have these unequal outcomes. Now, I would say we don't even have egalitarianism because women have all the privilege. Women have all the privileges that men historically have had without any of the effort to get it. So, for example, when the black man got the right to vote after the Civil War in 1873, 74, he had to serve in the Union Army to fight for his freedom, to prove his loyalty to the Union against the South. Women didn't have to do anything to get the right to vote. I mean, black men had to die for their right to vote. Women just got it gratis. And still, they want to be treated like princesses as well. Well, yet they depend. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It depends on the situation. It's kind of Talmudic that the feminist woman will take whatever outcome is most amenable to her, no matter where it's coming from, whether it's coming from a more chivalrous attitude that women should be deferred to, or a more egalitarian attitude that we're all equal. But either way, as long as she's the winner, then that's all that really matters. So I would say it's a gynocracy where women have all the political rights. Like I said, they get easier prison sentences. They tend to win custody battles. Their testimony is trusted over the man's in a domestic dispute, which is exactly the opposite what the feminists complain about, where the man's testimony was favored over the woman's. So I would say, to make it short, patriarchy is where men have the legal privileges, and gynocracy is where women have the legal privileges, and we're living in the former, or the latter, rather.
All right. Well, I mean, granted, you can say that there are certain legal privileges that women have, certain unequal outcomes between men and women, but there seems to be an awful lot of very powerful men pushing for feminism while using the casting couch to take advantage of female hypergamy. Harvey Weinstein is a good example of this. Furthermore, sexual liberation, which feminists have been promoting, mainly benefits men looking for sterile transactional sex. Women prefer a more emotional relationship, whereas men are generally satisfied with just purely physical relationships. So how can you reconcile this with the idea that we live in a gynocracy?
Well, again, it benefits some men, but also you look at the women that are able to. We look at the amount of university or registration. more and more women are succeeding in school, and there's article after article after article about men are failing in modernity. Well, and that's in part they're failing because when they're boys, they're pumped up full of all these drugs, which messes them up. And then if they grow, or they grow up in single households, which is another bad outcome for men. And every opportunity they get, they push them down. Now, obviously, someone like a Harvey Weinstein benefits, but now we live in the age of Me Too, so it's not entirely clear how long these chads can keep playing the game. And a lot of women have benefited from these legal transactions. A lot more women than men have, I would say.
So you would say that, although there are chads who know how to game the system, so like Harvey Weinstein, the system itself benefits mainly women as a class versus men as a class. And you would go back to, Harvey Weinstein would be similar to Mugabe in that he's an elite, but he's not ruling on behalf of men.
Exactly. Now, this is where my explanation would differ somewhat from the alt-right and the MGTOW. In the politics, Aristotle says that tyrants empower women and slaves because, to quote Aristotle, they have a good time under the tyrant. And the tyrant has nothing to fear. They're not going to rise up and overthrow him, unlike freeborn men united in fraternal love of the polis. And Isaiah says that as a punishment, women and children will rule over you. So empowering people empowering women, children, slaves at the expense of freeborn men is a classic playbook move from tyrants. And we see this again and again in the historical record, and we see it described explicitly in rationalizing the process by Aristotle. So, white freeborn American men circa 1860, many of them had fought Hitler. Many of them had overthrown the Third Reich and the Empire of Japan.
Don't you mean 1960?
Yeah, 1960, sorry. These are some tough hombres here. If you want to roll out a police state, you can't have those guys walking around. You're going to have to feminize them and incapacitate them, which is what they've done.
All right. I guess that's fair enough. But last question on the woman question. Why should women support the ideas you're espousing? What place would a woman have in a patriarchal West?
Well, I think, one, simply, it's just biology. It's a hand in glove. That's what women's biological urges and needs are, and they're happier that way. And we already see patriarchy winning. I mean, Islam is making huge headway in Europe. For example, the butch Irish singer Sinead O'Connor converted to Islam. What was in it for her? Well, I guess she likes being dominated by a man. I mean, she had the whole butch thing going, the butch haircut, the feminist, F the Pope attitude because he wasn't woke on abortion. I mean, and then now she's a Muslim. I mean,
so you're saying that women are naturally attracted to patriarchal societies or something like that, or patriarchal norms?
Yeah, I think so. I think when they see it in Islam, I mean, they just go for it. It's bizarre. I mean, there was a new atheist guy on YouTube I used to watch now and again. I forget, he was quasi comedian, and he was talking about this too. Why are these feminists? Why are these women converting to Islam? And I think it's because they're well, it goes back to Genesis chapter 3, right? Woman will have a desire for her husband. She wants to be under authority. Now, white men are such simps that, the sort of dangerous gangster mentality of organized crime, of people in the inner city and of Arabs, that's harmful. It's ultimately a very bad thing. But it's that mentality that they find they're attracted to. We see it again and again. Why do women love the gangsters in films? You watch films with gangsters and sociopaths, and they're always going for the bad boy because he's just this out of control, violent lunatic. Now, again, the patriarchy I'm advocating isn't some sort of gangland, but we already see that women are already moving in that direction.
All right, I guess that's so. I guess there is a certain. I guess there is a certain appeal to that if you are female.
Well, I guess let me rephrase it this way. Why is it that 50 Shades of Grey is the most popular literature for females to read?
That is, I mean, I can see that. I already knew about that, but it's kind of a stereotype, isn't it, that girls like the bad boys? I mean, I don't, and from what my research tells me, it's not that women like assholes. It's that women like assertiveness.
Yeah, the idea of being assertive. No, being assertive is on a spectrum. You can be a psychopath, or you can be, a reasonable guy who's assertive. So for example, Andy Nowicki, he used to be on the alt-right podcast with Colin Liddell and Richard Spencer before that went defunct. And he pointed out there was this song from the 60s called Johnny Get Angry, where the singer is wishing her boyfriend would give her a lecture and put her in her place. That was like the early 60s. And so we see this again and again, and the mask slips. I think the reason why we don't see more of it is I mean, let me put it this way. If this was not a natural impulse for women, why do we find all the feminist propaganda brainwashing? We wouldn't need the feminist propaganda brainwashing if this wasn't a normal impulse for women.
All right, I guess you have a point there, but let's see. I think our next question is our next set of questions is going to be on the atheist side. About atheism and religiosity. My first question on that is: New atheists claim that they are simply trying to free people's minds from superstitious and harmful beliefs caused by historic religions. Why is this wrong?
Well, because it's in part question begging what is a harmful belief. I mean, that was the rhetoric of the Bolsheviks, but of course, many new atheists would consider Bolshevism a harmful belief. And even within self-declared atheists, for example, Noam Chomsky famously stated that the new atheists were just another religion, a religion glorifying the state and imperialism. And Ayn Rand, in an interview, another atheist, in an interview with Phil Donahue, pointed out that Bolsheviks and these sort of like militant collectivist atheist types were also a pseudo-religion. Now, of course, Chomsky's not a pseudo-religion. Ayn Rand isn't a pseudo-religion. But the point to be taken is all of these atheist ideologies are themselves pseudo-religions, and they're willing to admit that of all their opponents, just not of themselves. So, there's that new atheist retort, we just go one God more. Well, all atheist religions are pseudo-religions. I just go one more atheist pseudo-religion than you do.
So, I mean, there is actually something that is pointed out by Mencius Moldbug. He said in one of his essays, he points out that there are religions, which are religions with no God, and there's mono-religions which are religions with one God, and it goes by religions, and then poly-religions, and it goes up and up and up. And he says, well, if you're an atheist, which religion would you choose? And there's nothing really inherent to a religion that you as an atheist would agree with, per se, because that a religion might have harmful beliefs in it, more harmful beliefs in it than a mono-religion, even if you disagree with the mono-religion on the number of gods.
Well, and also if we get to the aspect of liberating, so there's a common fallacy that the new atheists make, which often egalitarians and liberals make as well, they'll see that in the short term. Okay, let me give you an example of a 18th century. Let's look at Mozart, an 18th century composer. Now, when he was a child, he was under rigorous tutelage from his father, who was a musician. He could compose music at the age of 3. And I'm definitely sure he wasn't allowed a free range lifestyle. I'm pretty sure his dad, had him under his thumb studying music. Now, in those formative years, it would appear as if Mozart doesn't have a lot of freedom, doesn't have a lot of liberty, isn't really free to express himself from the modern point of view. But when you see the maturity of Mozart's work as a musician, which is only the result of that deferred gratification of his youth, then we see that his father liberated him. Mozart was liberated by his father's discipline to create beautiful art. And all new atheism liberates us for is fapping. That's it. Like, that's what we got. Christianity gave us Mozart, the new atheists gave us fapping.
So you would say that the new atheists' idea of free thought is actually a form of of undiscipline, unruliness.
Exactly. Basically, true. Okay, without any sort of specific theological concepts, freedom is even if we use their definition of freedom, an increasing range of choices. Well, if you're an ill-educated buffoon, you don't actually have the choice to be a great composer, because you can't do that. You haven't been trained to be a composer. Or to use a more popular example, if you haven't gone to the gym to become an athlete, you can't compete as an athlete unless you've trained. But training is discipline and deferred gratification.
And you would say that religion in general, and specifically the Christian religion, which is what new atheists mainly attack, provides that sort of discipline.
Exactly. Well, actually, Dawkins seems to admit it. What religion does is it gets people to be good when no one's watching. It gets people to exercise restraint, self-control, deferred gratification, and forward-thinking strategies without anybody actually being there to watch them. Well, I mean, there's God, but again, I'm not using any theological arguments here.
Oh, no, I think you've done a good job explaining this general problem with new atheism, which is, it sort of presupposes a kind of progressive liberal idea, a liberal idea that, if people were trained in these very strict moral codes, then if people are trained in these very strict moral codes, then they won't have the freedom to express themselves. But that's sort of a culture of narcissism, as Christopher Lasch would put it. I think the next question I have is, isn't atheism just lack of belief?
Well, isn't theism okay? Logic has a principle called double negation. So, not is logically so not A is logically the same as A, because the double negation negates itself. Now, the new atheists say theism is essentially not theism, or in the systematic logical form, tilde theism. Well, all theism is atheism, lacking belief in atheism. So theism is just lacking the belief in God.
Okay, well, I mean, it's just kind of, I always found that sort of idea to be kind of self-defeating, because you've basically turned atheism from a position that you could argue for the coherence of into what is essentially a psychological state.
Exactly. And the point of the glib retort is to just demonstrate through the reductio ad absurdum that this isn't really a position that you should waste too much time thinking about. It's just transparently absurd.
I mean, I guess that's fair, but modern and what's I think we can go to the next questions because it's another canard that new atheists bring up. They would say that God is just a fairy tale superstition created by primitive peoples, and in a civilized, enlightened age like ours, we don't really need a God. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say what the atheist historian Tim O'Neill says. These people must not have been reading European history and the history of European thought. Tim O'Neill is an atheist, and he has been hated by other atheists for debunking these myths. Uh, the idea that Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or Calvin or Paley did not create sophisticated, rational, thought out positions for God, or even pre-Christians like Plato and Aristotle, is just showing one's ignorance.
So you would say to that the 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 sort of this assertion by new atheists that God is a primitive superstition we've moved beyond is just kind of begging the question.
It is begging the question, and it's empirically false. The Soviet Union collapsed, and Putin has brought the Orthodox Church back. Atheism's dead. It's just a matter of time. I mean, the Soviet Union, Russia was the first domino to fall to atheism, and now Russia is also one of the first nations to reverse course on secularization.
But well, isn't I have to push back on you on that? Isn't atheists as a percentage of the U.S. population increasing? Aren't they increasing in number as a percentage of the U.S. population?
What ends up happening is when you have polls on religious belief, there's a category called nuns. The nuns are growing. But what atheists don't tell you is the nuns also believe in things like tarot cards, ghosts, poltergeists, UFOs. Not all nuns do not equal atheists. And furthermore, as people get older, have kids, get a job, and realize that the world, especially as they get close to death, they tend to come back to religion. We see this a lot. For example, a historic example would be Jules Verne. He was a French lapsed Catholic, but as he neared death, he returned to the church because life is about to end. You're not sure what's going to happen on the other side. So we see that happening as well. But more importantly, if we look at the demographic studies of Eric Kaufman, Philip Longman, and others, fundamentalist religions, specifically of the monotheistic variety. I've interviewed Eric Kaufman before and asked him if he has any data on non-monotheistic religions like Hinduism, Shintoism. He does not. So Jews, Muslims, and Christians and Mormons, which are kind of fuzzy as far as monotheist religions. But regardless, those four groups, the fundamentalists are winning because they're having all the kids and they're keeping most of the kids.
I mean, the liberals are basically aborting and contracepting and gay marriaging themselves out of existence.
Exactly.
So you would. So I get. I guess I guess we can cover sort of the last question on atheism before we move on to the more positive questions about Christianity specifically. But what if what if maybe you're right that religion and religious people they have this they do have a better biological chance of reproducing. But doesn't atheism have some kind of redeeming social quality, even if it's false? Aren't they? I mean, if we need somebody who can think outside the box of religion in order to progress in things like science and technology, right? I mean,
it would be very ironic for the de facto worshippers of Bertrand Russell to use an argument that Bertrand Russell condemned when used by Christians. He said Christians in his day were saying, well, look, even if we can't prove it to be true, it has positive social results. So shouldn't we accept Christianity on those grounds? And Bertrand Russell says, no, we shouldn't accept falsehood based on positive results. I'm like, well, interesting. I think it'd be very ironic for atheists to make an appeal to that argument.
I mean, you could see it. I mean, I don't see very many atheists making that argument, but it is entirely possible. I mean, they go on and on about all the positive benefits of atheism. I mean, I've heard things like, atheism is responsible for the advancement of science, the advancement of human freedom. Religious people, they persecuted people endlessly, but atheists gave us secular liberalism, which is which gave us like freedom and capitalism and things like that. What would you say to those people?
Without getting into too much detail, I think the science angle can be handily dealt with by looking at someone like Tim O'Neill. Again, an atheist, doesn't have a dog in the fight necessarily, but even he admits that the historical evidence does not bear out that Christianity was an impediment to scientific progress. In fact, it was in many ways a precondition. You can also look at the idea that, the demystification of nature. That would be the White thesis, where he says that by demystifying nature, monotheistic Christianity created the space for scientific inquiry.
If I remember correctly, he wasn't exactly a Christian himself. He was like a nature worshiper of some kind. I mean, he was saying that this was a bad thing.
Yeah, he was opposed to it. He thought it was a bad thing. And as far as human progress towards greater levels of tolerance, well, to give the devil his due, Constantine's Edict of Milan was a milestone in the history of tolerance, where most Christians, pagans, and Jews were allowed to worship throughout the empire in peace. And in fact, that was in part due to the tutelage of Lactantius. So we see even in the early 4th century, when Christianity becomes a tolerated religion, that there is this initial tendency towards some form of toleration. And even in the 16th century, when we see the revival of such thoughts to deal with the wars of religion, these are primarily religious thinkers like Jean Bodin, Pierre Bayle, William Penn, Roger Williams. And this is also detailed in a reputable secular source like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is just, again, a lack of knowledge of the relevant facts.
Okay, but one could argue that the ultimate cause of this kind of atheist secularism that sort of rules over us was this kind of factionalism. The religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. Wouldn't the increased, if you got your way and we revived a Christian society, wouldn't the increased religiosity create violent conflicts?
Well, you see, I don't think actually the wars of religion drove atheism. So by the Treaty of Westphalia, the wars of religion are over. And what European Christendom lasts up until World War I. I think what is the motivating factor of atheism in Europe and the United States is people growing up in Christian societies and seeing that their leaders, their parents, religious leaders, secular leaders who profess to be Christians don't live like Christians. So it's not so much that Christians were killing each other in religious wars. That happened centuries before the rise of atheism. I think, and there was no such conflict in the United States ever, and yet we still have the new atheists. I think it has more to do with religious people becoming too worldly, not living up to the standards they hold themselves to.
All right, I think so. Now, these are just some kind of critiques of. You wouldn't hear them. You wouldn't hear them necessarily from new atheists, but you would hear them sometimes from non-Christians. First, why should we adopt Christianity as our religion of choice for in the West? Why not adopt some kind of new age religion, or go back to the Nordic pagans or something like that?
Okay, as to post-Christian. So let me paint you a brief picture. In the beginning of the 20th century, from San Francisco to New York to London to Paris to Berlin to Moscow to Vladivostok, everybody had the same basic moral consensus, even if they were different branches of Christianity. You might be Orthodox in Russia, might be Protestant in the United Kingdom, might be Catholic in Spain. But the fact is, we all had the same idea of moral values. And what we see is that every attempt, both secular and non-secular, to replace that universal moral code that even different Christian denominations shared have failed. They haven't just failed, they failed miserably. So there's literally no reason to think that at this point in the game, we can find a successful post-Christian moral system. There's no reason to think we can do that. Pre-Christian moral systems, ancient Nordic paganism, Hellenic paganism, I think are unviable for a lot of reasons. One, a lot of people today are crypto-Christians. They're informed by a Christian set of values, even if they don't believe in the source of those values. And this was something that Nietzsche pointed out in some of his last works. He's like, yeah, you idiots, you can't have Christian values and not believe in the Bible. But they still try to keep this going. The sort of more violent, predatory, masculine paganism of the Greeks, the Romans, and the Vikings, I just don't see people gravitating towards. And they're not associated with, most people are comfortable with a certain set of material conditions, which ancient paganism has given us, which we have no reason to believe that ancient paganism could continue to propagate. These material conditions were created by Christian civilization in the 19th century. So we have every reason to believe that Christian civilization could maintain and add to these material standard of living into the future. So pre-Christian systems will probably be rejected for their moral deficits, their sort of cruelty towards all sorts of different groups, children, animals, the environment, women, and their inability to maintain the current standard of material existence. Post-Christian systems have all failed due to internal contradictions. So we only really have one viable set of options left. I guess you could say the only successful post-Christian system is Mormonism. Somehow Mormonism made the transition into a quasi-polytheistic religion that hacked the Protestant work ethic.
Yeah, they are a strange bunch, but what about the Eastern faiths? What if we adopted some of the ideas of the East, Buddhism and Hinduism? I mean, China might be bad right now, but that's only because, atheistic communists have taken it over. Maybe if we revived some of the older Buddhist and Confucian ideas in the West, we could have a better society.
Well, I mean, I could make some joke about India, but I think Japan does demonstrate that a sort of traditionally Eastern mindset can reach a very high level of sophistication in the modern world. I wouldn't deny that that's in theory possible. But nonetheless, the problem is it's not easy to transplant other religions. So if you view New Atheism as a pseudo-religion, in many ways, the cult of democracy and freedom is a pseudo-religion. And in many ways, in the Iraq War of 2003, the United States tried to spread the gospel of democracy through the sword via the very Islam they were criticizing. And that was not a tremendous success. Far from it. And I think that given the opportunity cost of having to transplant a new religion where we already live in a Christ-haunted world, it's just easier to go back to what we already had to begin with rather than bringing something entirely new.
I guess that's fair enough. So My next question is about theocracy. So, should we strive for a theocracy? What is a theocracy, and should we strive for one?
Well, the colloquial usage of the term theocracy is that clerics hold political power. Uh, I would oppose that. I think even in New England, the Puritans were often accused of having a theocracy. But if you look at the Massachusetts Bay Colony, those who held political office were themselves not clerics. But there's another definition of theocracy that was popularized by theonomists, a kind of radical Calvinist sect led by Gary North, Rushdoony, and groups like that, which just says the laws of God are enforced. Doesn't mean they're enforced by clerics, they're just the laws of the land. And by that definition, Christendom was a theocracy. So I guess it does kind of depend on what you mean by theocracy. If you mean the former, no, I wouldn't want that. If you mean the latter, yeah, we should.
Well, okay, but why should we strive for uh, God's laws to be the laws of the land? Why should I mean shouldn't we keep our laws secular? I mean, we have. I think we have. Shouldn't we keep our laws secular because we have a religious pluralism in America? All these different religions are going to conflict with one another on what God's laws actually are. So why can't we just try and keep things secular so that we can have a sort of neutral air? The politics can be a sort of neutral area.
Well, I think for reasons already stated, post-Christian secular morality is a failure. It doesn't work. And we're seeing this now even in Europe, where Islamic groups are creating Sharia law courts. Building societies within the currently existing European norms. But let's meet them on their own terms. Secular individualist humanists claim they value human flourishing. Now, I think most people would agree that the proliferation of the arts, the sciences, literature, innovation, theater, music, that's all a sign of human flourishing. Now, any cursory empirical study of history shows you that the greatest amount of human flourishing in the history of mankind is in the last 500 years of European history. And until about the last century, those were Christian centuries. We circumnavigated the globe under the banner of Christian religion. We started to fly 1906, 1907. The United States, the Supreme Court had to find the United States as a Christian nation in 1890. So, human flourishing is maximized under the conditions of, at the very least, a cultural Christianity.
All right, I guess that, yeah, and you would say we can't really justify cultural Christianity without the theological kind.
Exactly.
All right, I guess so, but I guess so. So that's this is the next question. This isn't necessarily an atheist saying this, but there are, because there are some Christians who believe this, but this needs to be addressed anyway. Historically, Christianity, the Christian faith, has been used to justify violence and bigotry towards lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender people. How would they fit into a more Christ-oriented society?
Well, I think a model for how this might look would be the United States prior to 1967. I think is when sodomy was legal. Well, it wasn't legalized all at once. It was a state-by-state basis beginning in 1961. I think it became national after a Texas ruling in 2004, which was 15 years ago. In the 20th century, gay people weren't hung, they weren't shot in the United States. They just weren't allowed to openly be gay. They were, one of those aberrations in society, but they weren't allowed to upend the social order.
sorry, I kept. Okay, so you would say, don't. The rule should be don't and do you can't harm them and persecute them outside of what is justified by the rule of law and what a fair trial would say. But at the same time, they're not allowed to do things that would undermine the moral order of the society.
Yes.
All right, fair enough. So let's say we have. I mean, what if? How is this Christian project of trying to enforce God's laws on the people of the United States? How is that going to go over with? How can that be reconciled with a pluralistic society?
Well, I would question whether we actually have a pluralistic society in the first place. The late Reformed apologist Greg Bahnsen argued that we live in a secular theocracy where atheism and secularism as the state religion, and that we're not allowed to question it. So the idea that you should assume God should not be in the public square is itself begging the question, why? Well, because it's divisive. Well, okay, atheism is divisive too. The Soviet Union, communist China. It's not entirely clear that that isn't divisive.
But secularism is supposedly the proponents of secularism would say that secularism is not atheism or theism or even agnosticism. It's entirely neutral. It's a neutral playing field between these different factions.
Well, in that regard, I would have to point to your boy Ed Feser when he wrote an article debunking the false neutrality of libertarianism. That it is a false neutrality, because once you start to actually look at individual cases, whoever is interpreting these cases comes at it with a more or less left or right wing slant, and the presumed neutrality that might have allowed us to solve these problems in a interesting or novel way just disappears, which is why we have the left libertarians and the right libertarians. The so-called neutrality didn't last very long.
All right. Yes, I see. So, last question. Why should a non-religious person support the ideas you're espousing? What place would they have in a Christian West?
Well, in a United States where there's a more or less acknowledgement that the laws that are the laws of the land are in some sense inspired by God's laws, it would be much like in 1920s America. You could be an atheist, presumably. The American, I think the American context in particular, and the Protestant context with Luther's statement, unless to go against conscience is dangerous. In fact, you could even argue the early Christian context of any faith that is coerced is no faith at all. That was a position that even Ambrose held to. Would be the governing ideal. So no, not everybody in the country has to be a Christian. It's just that if you're living in the country, the rules that are enforced, not rules of religious practice, but rules of right and wrong and public dealings, you couldn't transgress those.
All right, I guess that's I guess that could be a fair compromise. It's not necessarily you're forcing people to practice Christian Christian rituals or Christian morals. It's that or sorry, not you're enforcing a Christian morality. You're not forcing them to become Christian.
I mean, isn't that what secularism does today? They're not forcing me to be an atheist, but they're forcing me to live under laws that come from a secular source.
I guess that's fair enough. Okay, now this is the last question, and on sort of the race questions. Now now these are kind of kind. This topic is especially spicy in the modern day. Why do you think that is?
I think it's particularly spicy because it's the new taboo. So in the Victorian era, discussions of human sexuality was taboo, whereas discussions of race were not. So in part, this is sort of like the rebellion against the WASP culture, the sort of like perceived prudishness about sex and a rather liberal attitude towards discussing race. Um, Also, I think it's a taboo subject because to paraphrase um, Slavoj Žižek, when man kills God, he nothing is permissible because his own void of guilt, in the sort of Nietzschean sense, the guilt of killing God, forces him to invent new rules to live under, and he invents the new rules as a repudiation of the rules he revolted against. And I think actually Slavoj Žižek is onto something with that. These are the anti-rules. These are all the opposite of WASP culture that they're rebelling against. And because they have this Freudian guilt of killing the father, as Freud might put it, or Slavoj Žižek, they invent an inverted rule system to justify the murder of the father figure, the murder of God.
Okay, fair enough. Um, so racial activists on the left, they claim that they're simply trying to overthrow a system that has historically mistreated racial minority groups to equalize the playing field between whites and non-whites. Why is this wrong?
I think in many ways this sort of is analogous to my difference of the sexes. Even if we, in theory, could eliminate all legal privilege from one racial group over another, there would still be biological inequalities, which would lead to unequal outcomes. Now, there was, of course, legal privilege for white people. There was Jim Crow, there was segregation, and they're gone. We don't have those anymore. And then they'll say, well, we're still trying to redress those past injustices. But what it actually amounts to is an asset stripping of currently living white people. Nobody today was a part of slavery or Jim Crow or segregation. At least not the people the left are attacking today. We had nothing.
But the left, it would say that these people might have not perpetuated Jim Crow and slavery. That most of the people alive today, they might not have taken part in this oppression, but they still benefited from this oppression. And the black people living today are still victims of this kind of legacy. They did not build up the social capital because of this past oppression.
Well, again, I would say this begs the question: how long does it have to go on? Notice there's never any terminus to this. It's like, okay, there's this much money or capital or whatever that needs to be transferred. Once the transfer is complete, justice has been served, and we're done. That's never the way this is couched. Because if it were a matter of justice, especially distributive justice per Aristotle, we would have some rough quantifiable measurement of the asset transfer that needs to take place. There is none. And we also should have some idea of how long that should take. And we don't. So it doesn't bear any of the marks of redistributive justice, even though it claims to act in the name of it.
Well, presumably they're going to keep doing it until they reach this idea of equal outcomes.
Exactly. But you see, that's begging the question because there's inherent biological inequalities, just like between men and women. So
Such as
the fact that black civil Africa is arguably worse off now. Let's look at Rhodesia. Zimbabwe is far worse off now than it was under Ian Smith. The average IQ of Africa is 75. I think the average IQ in the United States is around 100. And so I'm sorry if 75 on the IQ scale is mentally retarded. So if the average IQ is mentally retarded on the IQ scale, you're not going to build spaceships.
So you would say that it's primarily about it's sort of like the bell curve between men and women. There's a differential bell curve between the white race and the black race.
Yeah.
All right, I guess so. Now, this is the next question that you hear all the time from the left. You hear from certain leftists that race is a social construct, and you also hear from right wingers that race is only skin deep. Are these wrong beliefs? Are they untrue?
Well, the left says race is a social construct, but white privilege exists. So is white privilege a social construct? But go ahead, sir.
I mean, yes, they would say white privilege is a social construct, and that's why we have to deconstruct the society in question.
Okay. But if we look at now again, a more sophisticated advocate of this, someone like say what's his name? His name is now People's Veto. He used to go by the name of
Alternative Hypothesis, Ryan Falk, I believe.
Yeah. No, again, he's not an academic. Kevin McDonald's an academic. There were academics in the early 20th century who held these positions. No, to the extent that I've looked into it, they tend to look at these things, they cluster around genetic phenotypes. That's what they would use as groupings in these kinds of studies. Again, I haven't studied it as depth as Alt-Hype or some of these other types have, but that seems to be the way they would go about discussing it. Also, someone like Lothrop Stoddard, who I have read, would go about it in that way as well. So no, it's a kind of trivial. See, this is what's weird from the right, right? The right is supposed to accept sexual distinction and dimorphism. And if you are going to accept that, at least in principle, then you're going to have to accept in principle for very similar reasons, racial bell curve distributions. So it's really odd for the right to be making this kind of argument today. The left just denies reality in toto. And, well, okay, I mean, what are you going to do?
I mean, but you hear this from mainstream right wingers like Ben Shapiro that race is only skin deep, voting is malleable, and you hear this also from, but then again, you also hear from Ben Shapiro's editor, one of Ben Shapiro's editors, Josh Hammer, that apparently anti-Semitism is in white DNA. So, which is it? Is it the? I mean, but what can you say to someone like Ben Shapiro who says, voting isn't really determined by race? What their other attributes besides their appearance aren't determined by race. Race is only skin deep.
Well, okay, man. Why doesn't Israel just open up its borders to Palestinians?
Because they're Muslims, Muslims.
No, but dude, it's voting is malleable. I mean, the Likud party just needs to work harder to appeal to Muslims.
So, would you say that black people have certain cultural differences that non-whites have certain cultural differences that that aren't necessarily found in genetics that preclude them from voting in a certain way?
Well, this is where we run into determinism, and again, I generally reject determinism. So we can look at genetic traits of men and women and different races. We can look at cultural traits. So, for example, on some of my critical positions on the alt-right, you can look at Northern Europeans who now are the source of all this innovation and capital accumulation. But in the age of the Greeks and the Romans were barbarians who had a standard of living little better than sub-Saharan Africa. And okay, well, what changed? Well, in that case, Christianity was the cultural change that took place. It took a while, but it eventually happened. So, is it purely genetic? No. Is it purely cultural? No. Is it purely environmental? No. There's these are all working together as independent variables on individuals and cultures and races, which makes it complicated to determine what is the primary cause. As we saw, Northern Europeans prior to Christianity were a little more developed than the Zulu. And yet, by 1900, England, the United States, and Germany were the three largest industrial powers on the planet. Now, that was clearly a cultural change. Some people argue it was also a racial change. Sean Lass and Hype have argued that the average European IQ was raised by capital punishment, killing off low IQ criminals. Maybe. I haven't studied that enough to confirm or deny it. But I think it's safe to assume that there wasn't that much genetic change between the great heathen army of the 9th century and Alfred Nobel of Sweden in the 19th century.
I see. All right. So this is something about, because you acknowledge that there is a double that you from your perspective there is like a double standard between the left on black nationalists versus white nationalists. The left will support will tacitly support the supremacist movements of non-whites, while treating white supremacists, so-called, as being inherently untrustworthy. But if you look at the history of white advocacy, white nationalism, you find that these groups have been uniquely predisposed to mistreatment of ethnic minorities. We can look at black slavery and Hitler and Jim Crow, South Africa apartheid, whereas their non-white counterparts don't seem nearly as predisposed to this kind of mistreatment. Furthermore, white racial advocates have historically based their arguments for why they should be in charge have to do with defending their historical dominance over other races, whereas non-white advocates, they base their arguments on, we just want equality with you. We just want to be free from your rules, your bigotry. Given these facts, don't you think it's reasonable for the left to have these different standards for non-white nationalists versus white nationalists?
Well, let's look at black nationalists. This is just a demonstrably false position. The earliest political black nationalist movement to take power was in Haiti, where they summarily executed something like 10,000 white Frenchmen. And not being satisfied with the blood of the white man, they started turning on their mulatto kinsmen who were too white for their taste. But since the mulattoes outnumbered the pure-blooded blacks, the mulattoes ended up winning. We saw what happened in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, where Mugabe instated black nationalism and disenfranchised and murdered not only the Rhodesians, but also the Matabele tribe, the historical tribal enemies of his own group. Also, South Africa, we have the systematic disenfranchisement of white people. Genocide Watch, in 2013, pointed out that South Africa is in the early stages of genocide against the white population. In fact, Donald Trump pointed to that recently. You had ANC rallies where they chanted "kill the Boer." Black nationalists are just as brutal, just as savage when they have power as anyone else. What does Nat Turner do when he leads his rebellion? He murders women and children. The only difference is there aren't that many examples because blacks haven't been in a position to have authority over white people. I think that might have some cultural and genetic reasoning behind it, but regardless, let me put it this way. A black man living in 1920s Jim Crow America had it immeasurably better than a white man living under Mugabe or a white man living under the Haitian dictatorship.
I mean, but you know, there's not okay. So maybe the
One more thing. Black nationalism is fascist. Marcus Garvey, the father of black nationalism, said that he invented fascism and that Mussolini stole it from him. But you'll never see a Vox article titled "The Troubling Fascist Roots of Black Nationalism."
that's really who was this guy? Uh,
Marcus Garvey, he was in the 1920s. He was the father of
Marcus
black nationalism.
Marcus Garvey.
Yeah, he was actually a fan of Mussolini until he invaded Ethiopia. And he was, reporter said, "Oh, aren't you just copying Mussolini?" He's like, "No, no, Mussolini stole it from me."
All right. Well, I think it seems like a very interesting guy. I'm gonna have to read up about him. But you know, we'd also, I mean, we don't all. We also do. Yeah, granted, you might be right about black nationalists, but what about other non-white nationalists? I mean, we aren't. Are there a lot of like? Yeah, are there a lot of like hateful Asian nationalists or Jewish nationalists?
well, Japanese nationalism was kind of brutal in the early part of the 20th century, uh, as is Chinese nationalism. You don't want to be a Uyghur living in China today. Uh, so Chinese and Japanese nationalism is definitely hazardous to the health of a lot of different groups of people. Uh, and it should be self-evident to the left that Jewish nationalism is dangerous because they're always complaining about Palestinians.
So you would, so I mean, you know, this seems to be a now you're sounding a bit more like an anti-nationalist. Shouldn't we just do away with the entire idea that racial nationalism should have a place in our politics simply based on that? All this you know, interracial conflict seems to be based on these nationalist groups vying for dominance.
I think there's two things here. Identifying the fact that white people are being discriminated against doesn't necessarily presuppose why. If you're a white nationalist, that's because, you know, of Zog and the Jewish organized movement. You know, you could be more moderate, like say American Renaissance type guy, and, you know, just view it as misplaced egalitarianism. You know, you could view it the way I do, as suppressing, you know, the adults in the room so the tyrant can have his court. But I would argue that the effort to stamp out national identities has led to more death than nationalism itself. The Soviet Union was a globalist force. International communism was a globalist force that sought to eradicate nationalisms and killed over 150 million people, according to you know, study modern democide studies. And we look at the wars, the First and Second World Wars, and the wars that the United States fights to keep the globalist system working. These conflicts are some of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. And I would argue that the attempt to wipe out national identity is more costly than preserving it.
So what we should do then is not oh, you okay?
Yeah, I just got a tickle up my throat.
Hmm. All right, fair enough. Uh, I guess my next question is, you know, so given it seems to me that the problem isn't national identity, but a sort of extreme nationalism. But the extreme anti-nationalism is also a bad thing. So what we should do is strive for a sort of moderation where we're not so nationalistic that we're going to just wipe out all the black people and ethnically cleanse America. But we're also not going to try and use the force of government to stamp out any expressions of white identity.
Something like that. I think basically taking a cue from Montesquieu, every state, or in this case, every nation, has a set of interests. And as much as possible, we should seek to accommodate these interests without necessarily harming the other.
All right, I guess that's fair enough. So I guess the what is it? So what do you find that's wrong with? I mean, there are some people who say that you know the idea. If you actually believe that there is like genetic factors in one's behavior that pertain to race, then then you're essentially denying people their free will. What would you say to those people?
Well, we have no trouble admitting that people are genetically disadvantaged for being quadriplegics, mentally or physically handicapped, and a whole host of reasons. Not that racial differences should be associated with mental or physical handicaps per se, they're political. That's why it's difficult to have a sensible conversation about it. There's no political interest group for quadriplegics or for amputees or anything like that. So the fact that they have some they are not up to the standard of the wider society doesn't mean we all kick them while they're down. Some allowances are made for that to help them get by. But we're not, when we admit that a quadriplegic or a person born without a leg or an arm is in some way handicapped, and yeah, his freedom is limited just by his biology. And all we can do is acknowledge that and try to make that easier for him.
All right, I guess that's fair enough. Um, Now, what would you say to those people advocating for the creation of a white ethno-state, either by ethnically cleansing all of America or by, sectioning off a part of America to be a sort of white preservation reserve, like an Indian reservation, but for white people?
Sort of like the Libertarian Free State Project, but for white nationalists.
Yeah, yes. Or that's also it's also something that Jared Taylor says that he supports. He supports like he supports like dividing the United States so that people who want multiculturalism can be in one spot, people who want a white ethno state can be in another spot, and then people who want a black ethno state could be in a different spot. What would you say to those types of people, and as well as the people who say, well, we need to kick all the non-whites out of America?
Well, as to the Jared Taylor type argument, I think that's, I mean, whether I personally prefer that or not, it seems a reasonable enough position. It's like the Libertarian Free State Project, or sort of like the Great Mormon Migration, which culminated in the state of Utah. There's no intrinsic moral objection to it. As far as wiping out everybody else, yeah, that would be a problem. I wouldn't, advocate for a civil war like that. But the thing is, when Israel ethnically cleansed the Palestinians, well, actually, some leftists oppose it, some don't. It sort of depends on the leftist you talk to. But I don't think
definitely a lot of right wingers, definitely a lot of people in the American right see that as being justified if they even acknowledge it happened.
Exactly. So I think what needs to be disentangled is means and ends. I mean, obviously, there can be a set of means you choose that are immoral in principle to achieve an end. But just because some means to an end are immoral doesn't mean the end itself cannot be achieved through moral means. Like, for example, a sort of free state project for white people, which is what Jared Taylor apparently wants.
Okay, but what about what do you think of the sort of Vaush argument that Vaush, being a left wing YouTuber, he argues that if we allowed these kinds of ethno states, and he applies this to all ethnicities, not just white people. If we allow for any kind of ethno state, like even like a free state project for white people, then that is inherently immoral because it will inevitably lead to a kind of evil white supremacist or racial supremacist society that will start persecuting people. And if they don't have any people to persecute within their country, they'll start invading outside.
Well, I mean, that's just anti-white bigotry. Would he apply that to the Jewish ethno-state of Israel? Would he apply that?
He actually advocated for. He actually said he would genocide lost tribes of isolated tribes in the Amazon because they're ethno-nationalists.
Well, doesn't that go back to the point that I made that globalism kills more people than nationalism?
That is true. The anti-nationalism. Thank you, Vaush, for providing a good. If you're watching this, and I doubt that, but if you ever watch this, thank you, Vaush, for providing a good example of anti-nationalism being just as murderous as Nazism. So anyway, going on here, going on to the next part. White people are going to be a minority in America eventually. Even if we get a moratorium on immigration rates, the non-white ethnic groups are simply have higher birth rates, and eventually they're going to sort of just outbreed us, and eventually whites will become a minority in countries that they were historically dominant in. Knowing this, shouldn't we try to appeal to go ahead of time to appeal to these racial minorities while we still have a chance, and reject the sort of extremist alt-right bigots in the movement, and try instead to create a sort of pro-black nationalist conservatism?
Well, I think this actually is an answer to an earlier question you asked. Why should we return to Christianity? Well, to keep white birth rates up, for one thing. But actually, I sometimes question how dire the situation is, because again, I've read his book, Eric Kaufman's book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And I've also interviewed Eric Kaufman and asked him this question directly. When does he think that, religious fundamentalists in the United States will take over? He says, well, probably within 100 years, they'll be the dominant electorate. Now, the declining white population is the declining of secular population, liberal Christians, liberal Jews, liberals. But there's a groundswell of fundamentalists, which we don't see yet. And I wonder, there does seem to be some reason to think that they can pick up the slack as these other numbers collapse. We actually see this in Israel, where the Hasidic Jews, who were a tiny minority in 1947 and given a military exemption, are slated to be half the population by 2050, in which case Israeli national defense would be impossible if they don't forfeit their military exemption status. So we're already seeing the Jewish fundamentalists taking over their own country.
Oh, well, that is, I guess that could be. It's just that, there are a lot of people talking about how whites are going to be a minority in 2045, and maybe that's due to immigration. But I mean, if we don't get that immigration cap, and whites are slated to become a minority because of immigration, wouldn't it be advantageous for us to go work ahead of time and try to appeal to black nationalists, oust the alt-right bigots, and try to get in with the people who are going to be in charge?
Well, I guess the argument I make to that is a similar strategy was pursued by William F. Buckley Jr. to build a right coalition, and it failed, because basically the conservative Inc. is now infiltrated by progressives, very institution that Buckley created and tried to make conservatism respectable. I don't think that even worked when he tried it. And for him, the crazy bigots were John Burgess, who thought the president was a communist. Now, Notice it never placated the left. They still hated Conservative Inc. after he expelled all those people. So the left doesn't act in good faith. You're never going to make them happy. Now,
well, we're not talking about the left. We're talking about race conscious African Americans.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to, well, okay, let me put it this way. Demographic displacement is not going to happen from the African American community. They're aborting children at a greater rate than white Americans are. So the demographic displacement will not come from them. It's probably going to come from Latinos. And now, if we go there, probably the best strategy to pursue there would be to some extent reach out and say, look, we're white Christians, you're Latino Christians. Let's at least try to find some common ground on our shared religious beliefs.
I guess, and would you oust the alt-right bigots who hate Hispanics?
Well, I mean, according to Ben Shapiro, Donald Trump is an alt-right bigot. I think it's becoming an increasingly vacuous term. And as far as ousting, the alt-right leadership isn't even in the mainstream conservative movement. You don't have Richard Spencer, Greg Johnson, or anybody from the Daily Stormer. They're not even in there to oust in the first place.
I mean, well, they would say Donald Trump and Stephen Miller. I mean, Stephen Miller shared a VDare article recently.
Well, yeah, and then Donald Trump was called alt-right. So no, I don't think you should kick out Donald. I mean, Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan are called alt-right. It's kind of like calling someone Nazi. It's not really all that useful anymore as a term.
But it's like they say things that offend Hispanic people, don't they?
Well, Donald Trump won more Hispanic votes than any Republican president in living history.
He did.
So there isn't a very good correlation to that claim.
It's just, so I guess I'm just kind of, I'm just kind of skeptical about the sort of viability of Hispanics switching over to the Republican side or the conservative side, because a lot of them support hate speech laws and things like that. And conservatives won't be able to win them over unless they find some kind of compromise with the Hispanic interest groups.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, at this point, I think some form of violence is baked into the cake due to all sorts of different conflicting, non-negotiable interest groups. How that's going to untangle itself is anyone's guess.
That's it. That does sound unfortunate. I mean, so you would say that the alt-right is correct that we're going to have this kind of race war happening?
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be on the right with a race war. Many far leftists, talk about a sort of working class versus the corporation. Something like that could happen too, as more and more jobs are shipped overseas. People are going to get more and more disgruntled and turn to sort of domestic solutions, which could lead to some form of violence. There's just lots of different flashpoints that I think are just too numerous to unfortunately deal with.
I see. Irreconcilable special interest groups.
I mean, yeah, we're getting to a point like the United States in 1860. In 1860, there was no peaceful solution.
So one last question. Let's say that it was possible to. You're saying that white people will have this sort of dominance in our society later on. I'm on my last couple of questions, but I want to hear these questions. First off, what kind of place should white people have legally? What kind of legal status should white people have vis-a-vis other races. Do you think that and yeah, I mean, do you think that white people should have more legal privileges than non-whites?
Well, if we look at how we have it today, um, there's two ways that we've seen this dealt with. The alt-right says, well, if other racial interest groups can organize along the interests of their race, so should white people. And then you have the conservatives who say, well, no, nobody should be allowed to do it for any reason. And the left says everybody but whites can do it. Those are the three options on the table. It's difficult to imagine how you get everybody to quit doing it. And it's also difficult to imagine how you get whites to just take it indefinitely. I think, I mean, if you're going to have an NAACP or Hispanic interest group, stands to reason you should be allowed to have a German interest group, an Irish, an Italian, et cetera, et cetera. Would it be ideal if we didn't have these? Probably, but it's difficult to envision how they'd all go away.
So you would leave it up to a negotiation between different racial interest groups to decide which legal type of privileges there should be should be given to each kinds of groups. I mean, would you support a sort of legal egalitarianism between races?
I mean, at this point, it's becoming more of a necessity. It's in the same reason that empires tended to tolerate religions. There were just too many religions in the empires they ruled, so Darius the Great had to be tolerant because there's just too many religions. You couldn't force all of them to go away. And now that the United States has changed its demographic context so greatly, it's difficult to envision. Some sort of compromise is probably going to have to be reached. You're not going to be able to wipe out white people. They have too many guns, and it would lead to a race war, which would be very bad. But also, you can't, wipe out everybody that's come in, because that would be a similar level. It's difficult. I don't think there really are any easy answers at this point.
All right, so you would support a sort of legal egalitarianism between the races as a compromise between different racial interest groups, and but what's wrong with what's but you're not going to try to equalize outcomes, because the left's idea is, well, we got to equalize the outcomes. But you said earlier that that's not true. That's not a good idea. But what about what about the kind of compromise that gives races that are biologically unequal legal privileges to make up for their biological inequality? Like, I could envision a sort of idea where black people are given sort of affirmative action sort of deals in order to make up for their lacking performance.
Well, what we see is it only ensures the lack of performance. So the single motherhood epidemic and the violent crime epidemic in the inner city of minority households was pointed out about 60 years ago by Moynihan, a Irish Catholic Democrat, due to the lack of fathers, the collapse in the family, which is directly correlated and caused by welfare policies. So the classic argument against that would be that these policies, in fact, create and accentuate the conditions that lead to unequal outcomes. Because from like 1920 to the mid 1950s, the black middle class was rising. They were lifting themselves out of poverty, and then that all set back in again with civil rights and welfare. So I think the libertarians and conservatives are generally correct when they say that this leads to the exact opposite of the stated outcomes.
All right. Finally, why should a non-white person support these kinds of ideals that you are espousing? Why should a non-white person want to have that kind of compromise with you?
Well, in the long run, if any, as we see with any group, I mean, look at Israel's Samson option, right, where they're going to take down a whole bunch of nations with them if they feel like they're going to be wiped out. If a nation or a race or a group of people feel like they're going to be exterminated, who knows what they'll do? I mean, Israel's Samson option is pretty brutal. So I don't know what a Samson option would look like for white America, but it would not be a pretty picture. I don't think anybody would want to go through that. And if the alt-right is correct, that is, you drive whites further and further to this extremity, then yeah, they'll just become alt-right because, you know, that's the best option for them. And second of all, I'll quote my friend Keith Preston, I'd rather be a black guy living in the United States anytime in the last century than living in Africa.
That is, I mean, the material conditions are certainly better in America for Black people. Do you think that? So I guess you have answered, to my satisfaction at least, all the questions I have written down. But there was one question in the chat that I wanted to address. By the way, Cameron Gilchrist, you are the comment of the video today, and this is and you were asking a question: Is the fight for race? Is the fight for race, or is it for Western civilization? Well, I think Todd Lewis and I generally agree that it is a fight for Western civilization, but you have to understand that there are different aspects to Western civilization, and one of them is the ideas unique to European culture. The battle for Western, it's a battle for ideas, and generally speaking, non-white people do not have these kinds of ideas. You know, it might be, and it's mainly down to, you know, a combination of genetic, environmental, and cultural factors. So, you know, in any sort of fight for Western civilization, you will have to take into account, you know, the quote unquote racial interests of whites, so to speak, because, you know, the people who are fighting for the destruction of Western civilization are attacking from a racial angle. I hope that answers your question, Cameron. Now, we've been going for a couple of hours now. Do you want to wrap things up? Tell me, why is it? Let's wrap this up with one last question. Why is it that why does a person's you know, kind of reasoning abilities, why are they lacking if they are living in 2019 and they don't see some of the these issues the way you do?
The short answer would be the obvious dysphoria. Men are obviously not treated equally with women. Whites are obviously not treated equally with blacks. And Christians are obviously specially targeted, whereas Islam and Judaism are protected.
I see. All right. Well, I think that there is sort of, yeah, I do think that there is this sort of kind of dissonance on the part of some leftists when they argue. It feels like they are sort of ignoring all these areas, you know, all these different areas, and they're also presuming egalitarianism when there is no egalitarianism to be. There's no reason for it, you know. And I think it's summed up. Watching an interview between Jared Taylor and some left-wing reporter who was interviewing him. And the left-wing reporter was basically acting like if egalitarianism was false, then that would justify just open genocide. You know, if all these group, if not, if egalitarianism was false, then everybody would just start killing each other. Everybody would just become Hitler. And it's kind of the, and I think that kind of hysteria is what drives the egalitarian mania. It's this idea, and I think I can go back to the beginning. The people, what I said in the beginning about Jews, but this this applies to all leftists really. They have this idea that anything even tangentially associated with Hitler, what you know, masculinity, whiteness, and you know, traditional, you know, and traditional ideas, even though, you know, Hitler wasn't really that much of a traditionalist, but, you know, he was a traditionalist compared to the leftists. And the if Hitler, if anything, if the left can can see some kind of connection between Hitler and these abstractions, then these groups, then they'll just go crazy and try and attack those groups. You know, they want to eliminate what they see as sources of oppression and sources of genocide, and they ignore the sort of genocidal impulses of the members of their own coalition. You know, black nationalists, anti-nationalists, atheists, etc. So, any final thoughts on that?
No, I would agree.
All right, so we're coming up. I guess we've had you on, and it was really nice talking to you, Todd. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me on, Geocon.
All right, this is episode 3 of the Geoconservative Files, and we're signing out. Have a nice day, everybody.